I want to say that I really am very grateful Jim Gill invited me, and that I worked with both Jim and Linda in preparation for this presentation. And I want to say right at the outset that it's going to be very interactive. When I saw the agenda with Pat Flynn all the way down for the morning and then possibly into the afternoon, I held my breath. I don't know what you did. But we're in this together, and I want to say why. Because for me, as I've done the reading and the research, the talking and the reflecting, both among SSNDs and with some associates, I think this movement is still evolving, even though I think there are members here who have been associates for 16 or 18 or 20 years, longer than 20? How long? 29. You want to stand up, Loretta? Through some of the writings of some theologians, cultural anthropologists, we're going to explore what this I say phenomenon, but I don't think I'm right, what this grace movement in the church is about. Not only the church here in the United States, in Canada, but around the world. And you have the answer because you're associates. You have some of the answers to this exploration that I am eager to hear and to integrate it with what I know as a vowed member of the SSNDs. So to begin, what's today's date? You need to enter into this meditation, as I would say. So it's July 29th, Friday, 1847. Go back. The ship Washington begins its entry into the New York harbor. Mother Teresa records in a letter that she sent to her spiritual advisor, Matthias Siegert, that at 5 p.m. on July 30th, the ship docked in New York. Teresa and Caroline, 3 other sisters and 1 novice arrived in the so-called New World. Teresa writes, and this letter spans a period of time. Praise and glory to God and Mary. Yesterday, Friday, July 30th, at 5 p.m., we set foot for the first time on American soil. And then, after some experiences in the New World, she includes in this same letter, deep within my heart is the realization that America will either give a great impetus to our congregation or destroy it. Now, we know that Teresa had a terrible voyage over. Those 3 weeks on the ship, she was practically in bed the whole time. I've often wondered what it was like for her to go back and probably alone or maybe with a lay woman companion, because women in those days didn't travel by themselves. But what it was like for her to go back a year later, because the voyage was so difficult for her. Deep within my heart is the realization that America will either give a great impetus to our congregation or destroy it. We, you and I, know the answer. And as Mary Luke writes in the foreword to the volume on the North American Foundations, translated by Mary Hester Valentine, all of the Milwaukee province, I quote, we offer a prayer of gratitude and an affectionate smile, rejoicing that Mother Teresa had vision enough to take a risk. I will point out in various and sundry places how your title, Charism, Alive, is already reflected in the beginnings of the congregation, especially here in America, that Teresa had vision enough to take a risk. We're here today because of this woman, Theresa of Jesus Gerhardinger, who had a vision, who took a risk, made a journey, and had new beginnings here on this continent. Would each one of you tell each other how your first connection to SSND? No talks, but just say, I first knew SSND as, for myself, I was raised in the Army because my father was Army. I had 5 grade schools, and it was a freshman in high school that I went to the School Sisters of Notre Dame, as they say on the East Coast. And that's when I first met the SSNDs. That's what I want you to share with each other. Who is the first SSND you ever met? Would you tell each other? Make sure everybody gets a chance, 30 seconds each.
1987 when I went into the Lay Ministries Formation Program in Regina, and Sister Harriet Schnurr came and taught us about prayer, and that was my first encounter with SSNDs.
Now, what do I want to do today, or this morning, really? 2 years ago, I spoke to the Baltimore Associates and SSNDs on the topic of charism and said Carriers of the Vision was the title of the presentation, stating very clearly that associates as well as vowed members are carriers of the vision of SSND, of the charism. So vision and charism. In that presentation, I touched on concepts from Bernard Lee, Margaret Susan Thompson, and Sandra Schneider's on their concepts of charism. And for me, and I don't know for the participants of that session with associates, the invitation to look at charism and deep story and deep narrative. And that's a different concept than charism, which we'll see as I proceed to present this material. So today I want to expand on that presentation that we are all carriers of the vision. We do it differently as vowed members and covenanted associates. And also weave into this the presentation that Mary Maher did last year at the 2004 symposium. The title of her presentation was Only Connect. But she developed more fully and also in a very wonderful and scholarly way the sense of charism and deep story that Lee and Thompson and Schneider's all referred to, and which I referred to in a couple of years ago, but developed it much more fully. She speaks clearly and often about Lee's concept that we reinvent the charism for this, our time. We don't reclaim it. We don't have this gift that we bring to the present time. She speaks of reinventing the charism. And I am fascinated how you as associates reinvent the charism. I'm fascinated really to understand how SSNDs, vowed members, reinvent the charism. So I would like to integrate that, the carriers of the vision and Only Connect, with Mary's presentation using Lee, Schneider, and Thompson. But it's together that we're going to look at theory of it all and then apply it in these our times. I want the time together to be very interactive. If I'm up here talking, that's 1/4 of what we have to do. Together we need to explore this. Also, as a second part of this, I always need to give witness. Part of me, I think, is a Baptist. And on occasion, I watch tele-evangelizers, is that what they're called? Among other things. But it's important for me to give witness to you about Theresa, especially Mother Theresa, in my life, and also how I have seen the deep story revealed in the congregation. I have a unique privilege of having visited so many parts of the congregation and know so many stories of how the charism, how the deep story has come to be. It's in a sense to meet your topic in a sense of charism alive. I want to do this in a very interactive manner. And when I ask you, are you tired? Do you need a break? If you don't answer me, you need to answer me. Let's do it together. If you need, whatever you need, let's talk about what we can do together to make this an enriching morning and an enriching day. I also want to give what is absolutely essential, periods of time, and hopefully long periods of time, when you can go apart and reflect on what you've heard, what you're sensing, what you're feeling. In mutual discernment, you, the associates, have felt and known the fit between the call to be an associate of the School Sisters of Notre Dame and the charism of the SSNDs. And there is mystery in all of that. Pause for just a moment and say to yourself, when did I first begin to contemplate this call to be an associate? And what did that do to you?
1998, I applied to be an associate. And so I made my first covenant in 99. But it was those three issues. I mean, you do many other things as School Sisters of Notre Dame. But that education and the women's issues and the poor, those are what spoke to me.
And it was in 1999. And I've been, I've tried to be very active now that I'm retired. And my children are, of course, married, so I'm free to come and go as I please. And so I I enjoy it. I love going to the Mother House. I walk into the Mother House and I just feel peace, and I feel there's a warmth there.
I've really been blessed for the last 25 years to have close connections with the School Sisters of Notre Dame. And I think it's because of that connection that I said yes to becoming an associate. The associate program is just an opportunity to not necessarily walk with the sisters, not to follow their path, but to walk in a parallel path.
My driver from yesterday, whom I will not name, I asked her, how did you first learn about the SSNDs or about the associates? She had SSNDs in school. And a friend of hers gave her the material, and it took her a couple of years to really deal with that call, that material. How long did it take you? For you, was there a mystery about it? And I want to say today that you have got to tell me if this is right or wrong, not right or wrong, but if this is a good understanding. With this movement of the associates, which is a grace and gift in the church which is still being revealed, what more are you called to? Or is it enough right now? I maintain that there's a more being called for. And I'd like to explore that with you. You shape the charism, but the charism also shapes you. We're going to talk about your reinventing the charism for the SSNDs, even as the SSNDs reinvent the charism for this our time. And so we believe that each of us is a carrier of the vision of the congregation. We need to say what that vision is. But do you know that you carry the vision of the congregation? As an associate, are you more than who you used to be because you're an associate? Do you believe you carry the vision? Do you believe that you can interpret the vision? Does it give you energy about this reality? There certainly is a lot of energy in this room today as you meet one another. How many are meeting new people for the first time among the associates? Let me reverse that. How many are not meeting people for the first time? Why does that give us energy? Is it because it's new people, that we're new people? Is it something about the fact that we share some commitment as an associate? Are you awed by the gift of this call and the action that you've taken? And a gift is given to be used. And I'm going to ask you how you use the gift that you've been given. And if you're not using it, are you impelled but hold back about using this gift as a carrier of the vision? In You Are Sent, it says that through the members of the congregation, through the associates of the congregation, I'm adding that, our charism continues to develop in the living community. Are you not a community? Which, enriched by the past, enables the congregation to unfold in the present and be challenged by the future. I am sure you have heard those words before. How does the charism continue to develop in you, the living community of associates? We are called to take this charism, this founding dream, this sacred energy, this power that comes from the charism, to hold it freely, authentically, honestly, so that the charism can have a future not for its own sake, but that it can be at the service of the world. I want to say that I believe, or I think, or I'm exploring that you have the charism as associates, but that your gift as a member of the Associates of the School Sisters needs to be at the service of the world. It's not just for yourselves. We have to let the charism, the vision, overwhelm us and let it take us, and in a sense, let God take us where God will. Are you called to that kind of abandonment to God? Are you frightened by that question? Are you called to that kind of abandonment to God? Bernard Lee asks if associates really own the charism of the congregation. And I quote, "To absorb and transform a charism into a really passionate and abiding ownership takes time." You certainly are giving time this weekend. What does giving time to this at your local level look like? Is it just coming to periodic meetings? I ask that not in any judgment way, but to say, how do you take time to absorb and transform the charism into yourself and into your life? And that's why that second question is part of your homework. When you look at the needs in yourself, in your family, in your neighborhood, in your workplace, in the United States or Canada or wherever you're from, what aspect of Theresa's charism comes to play in any of those sections of your life? I'm going to ask, I think there are two pictures that I want to circulate. And this goes back to, I think you have one. This goes back to Mother Teresa landing 1847. And the pictures kind of capture what a young girl in Stadthof drew on a wall outside the school about Mother Teresa coming to America. And she has a perky little 12-year-old with blonde curls and one of those Bavarian hats, a felt hat with a feather. At 12 years old, she's walking from the ship onto the shores of America as a demonstration of what she understood Mother Teresa was about. Now that's a picture from a child or a young girl. In terms of the charism, what I'm asking you to do, if you had to draw a picture of that charism for you, some event out of Mother Teresa's life, what would you draw? What would you symbolize? What stories did this child hear about Mother Teresa that caused her to draw that picture? Let me read to you what Miriam Jansen, SSND from St. Louis, who lives and works at the College of Notre Dame in Baltimore, wrote. And this will also be available on a video. For Mary Theresa of Jesus, contemplation and ministry shared an intimate relationship. There were only blurred distinctions between contemplation and ministry. The transforming power of God moved through her. Her vision of God was the driving force of her dreams. It was full of creative power, a wellspring of hope. The dramatic breakthroughs of her ministry were really dramatic breakthroughs of the sacred, of God at work in the 19th century. Let me stop there. If there are times in your family, with your partner or spouse, or in your workplace, or in your local church or community, where there's been a dramatic breakthrough through you that reflects the charism of Theresa, that's what Miriam is talking about in this quote, that they are breakthroughs of the sacred, of God at work in you and through you, to your family, to your friends, to your workplace, to your community. Do you reflect enough on that to claim that and deepen that? Teresa's love for God could wait no longer. Her heart was set on the kingdom. You can see it in her writings. Out of this experience of love meeting love grew the sound of the congregation, our charism. It was God's love touching her life and her total response that became a pure beam of light for the world. It was grace given and received. She did not possess the gifting, it possessed her. You are possessed by the charism. In God's provident care of you, you are possessed by the charism. It was her prophetic moment. Her story, indeed, is a narrative of resurrection. And it defies an intellectual explanation. How do you explain why you are an associate? Some of it will defy explanation. Again, with my driver from yesterday, I said, well, how did your family take that you might be an associate? And she said they were okay with it. I mean, she gets teased about it a little bit. They call her sister. But she's more than that. She's more than that. The soul of the congregation was born and grew in Theresa. These pure beams of sunlight of grace are the well springs of our spirituality and our prayer, so that we can be the living charism in our moment of history. Now, I would like you to take that second question. These pure beams of sunlight of grace are the wellspring of our spirituality and our prayer, so that we can be the living charism in our moment of history. I want you just to take, it says, are you aware of the critical needs of our times? Would you think for a minute about one aspect of Theresa that's meaningful for you and that resonates with you, one aspect of Theresa's life? And then look at some of the critical needs and how would you put those two together? I'd invite you just to concentrate on your life, your workplace, your neighborhood, or church, because we're going to do a little bit more with the United States, with Canada. And then at your table, and again, if you could get into smaller groups of maybe 3 at the most, would you share an aspect of Theresa and a need where that relates? For me, an aspect of Theresa is her courage to risk something. And that's why I started to pass around that picture from that little girl. And why I said to you about Theresa coming in 1847 with her companions. She really had a very difficult time on this continent. She was very reluctant to leave the sisters. That year, and she stayed a year, she expected really to go back in a few months, but she didn't. And I wondered about her reasons for that. One is, I think she was so sick from that trip, she really had to regain her energy. And then she saw the tremendous size of this continent and all the things that happened that said, go home. Bishops didn't want her. They wore secular dress because they were attacked on the streets, certainly of Baltimore. And I thought to myself, and yet she kept on keeping on. And when I die, on my tombstone, wherever I'm buried, I want you to write about me, she kept on keeping on. That's what Theresa says to me. I want to keep on keeping on, even if they're big mistakes, big graces, big gifts, big accomplishments, or big mistakes. Can you imagine to keep on keeping on? To hang in there? Your explanation can't be that long, okay? So I'm going to ask you to share one aspect of Theresa, one need, or what it means to you, and wherever that takes you, really in groups of 2 or 3, so that I'll give you maybe 5 or 6 minutes, and then I'll check where you are, and then after that I think we're going to take a break, okay?
We're going to need nature's mood.
Mother Teresa, her words of encouragement throughout the years have gotten many of us through many difficult times in our lives, whether it's been a death in the family or a serious illness or a bad time in our lives when we really don't feel like talking to anyone else.
We all meet obstacles in our life. And sometimes you need to meet somebody who's overcome obstacles. Obstacles that you think nobody can overcome. That I really admire.
So we continue to look at charism. And what I want to say is that charism is never tidy. It is dynamic, it's living, it's generative, it gives life. And it continues to evolve in us and through us individually and in the entire congregation. And you as associates have a particular call to reinvent the charism as associates. We members of the SSND have to let it go so that you can do that. And that's one of the small group conversations I'm going to invite you to eventually, is what does the appropriation of the charism look like for associates? I'm not saying change the charism, but I want to do a little bit more about charism as identity, deep story, and then integrate more fully what Mary Maher said about reinventing the charism, all out of really Lee's book, The Beating of Great Wings. But this is a both and. You have work to do as associates, and we school sisters have freedom to move into, to let it go and let you. And that together we shape the congregation. That is no small task. At least that's where I see where it is. So charism is never tidy. It's dynamic, living, and generative. Charism has to do with identity. It is about who we are as a religious congregation within the church and world. And who we are is fundamental to what we do. The charism of the congregation is most significant in identifying and distinguishing the group. While we could parallel many apostolic congregations with ourselves as SSNDs, there is something about us that makes us SSND. And it is that which the members of the congregation have in common at the deepest spiritual level, some sense of identity. Congregational charism, and it's true for us, is a slowly developed, deep narrative that began as a seed with the calling together of the first members. It is a sense of deep identity which enables a congregation to be faithful to itself through incessant and sometimes dramatic changes or circumstances. For example, one of our stories that identify us is after the Second World War, when Mother Fidelis, here in Milwaukee, wrote to the General Superior, who had written to the sisters in America especially, and said, it would make sense if you don't remain part of the congregation, given what Germany has done in terms of the Second World War. And the famous line went back, your daughters in America have remained faithful. Your daughters in America have remained faithful. That is so deeply ingrained in us. Mother Teresa, this whole desire for unity was reflected after the Second World War, when there were Americans killed by Germans and Germans killed by Americans. And we know across Europe, the same thing for the Canadians, that we were enemies politically and at war. Your daughters have remained faithful. We will not let go of the unity. That becomes so deeply ingrained in us that we can't imagine it not being part of us. In your life as associates, when have you lived out that kind of fidelity to unity Has it been in your marriage if you're married? Has it been in a relationship? Has it been in a workplace? Somehow that is in us. This deep narrative that is our identity, this deep story, as they say, unfolds historically. It happens in a time and place, and gradually comes to include myths about the congregation, about our foundation. Just like that picture that's passing around, this bouncy little girl with her curls and her hat getting off the boat in America. There was something about bringing life in that picture. So the myths, the symbols of SSND. Where did this symbol of associates come from? Who designed that? Anybody know?
Milwaukee province wanted something, a symbol, and so we talked about the vowed pin, but we knew it had to be different, so we did the hands for mutuality. And so then Sister Rainey, after we had talked about it, designed it, and that's how it.
Whose hand are you shaking? Whose hand?
Each other's sister and associate.
Each other's associates, each other's with the members.
With other associates? With Mother Caroline?
Okay. Reflect on that symbol. Reflect on that symbol. What does it mean? And if an associate had designed it, would you have designed this? Interesting. Yes, sister.
Canada has a different one, and Carol is wearing one.
You want to say something about the Canadian? Sure.
Yeah, this was designed by one of our male associates who now has passed away. But they thought they wanted something a little different from that. They wanted to have a gold color versus a silver to distinguish it from the sisters. And the sisters felt strongly that we should have a different color. So we have the hands at the very, very base. It's hard to see. The hands are at the base, the cross, and then the M for Mary around the cross. It'll say SSND Associate. So it's just a little different from that. Yeah.
The struggles and the triumphs of a congregation, of its members. The projects and challenges. I often wonder that eventually, when there has been more time, that the struggles and triumphs of our sisters in East Europe, all of East Europe under Soviet domination, will need to be analyzed as it kind of becomes part of the core description of who we are. The projects and the challenges of all the units of the congregation and the congregation, our works and commitments, that the group lived in and through together, which now belongs to and shapes the spiritual, social, apostolic identity of all the members and of all the associates. This shapes you. And your story needs to, I see that as kind of something filtering down. This story needs then to become part of the myth, the symbol, the deep story of the school sisters. That's what I mean by you shape the charism, this identity. And so you need to spend time, I'm inviting you to spend time on this appropriation of the deep story of the charism. What we have in common among ourselves and with no one else is precisely our complex and unique shared history. The particular articulation of the God quest that motivated Mother Teresa to found the congregation. It's a unique vintage that has been sown, grown, harvested, pressed, distilled, stored from the experiences together, which is the life-giving drink we share when we come together and offer to others as our own lifeblood poured out in service that is charism. We all know what a wine press is, how it presses the grapes to make to get the juice that will then be, what do they do with that juice? They ferment it. It's that image. That's why, and Diane said maybe I frightened some of you that are going to be on that video, that I want to see what you say, but it's those stories of why and how that become part of this distillation, that become part of us and that will shape us and make us different. This is a poem by Jessica Powers, The Gift of Love, and that's what I think I'm calling all of us to. Jessica Powers was a Carmelite sister, and she was, I think, Sister Paracleta. My thoughts of you are fair as precious stones, out of the memory's deep, mysterious mines. I cut and polish, hold the gems to light, color of seawater, color of wines, coax from the earth's sweetest fruits. I drop them down into my heart, into the lifted hands of love, whose lone concern is your renown. Ultimately, the distillation of your call and your life among us, all of us, the School Sisters of Notre Dame, the congregation, becomes part of the sweetest fruits of the congregation. And it's for God's glory and only for that. I believe it's a healthy sign that's been ongoing in this congregation that we grapple with the meaning of charism. It shows the dynamic, generative spirit, and maybe it's only in this age, the 21st century, that will answer the question about its meaning. That charism is for its time. It needs to be reinvented in each time, but that what we need to claim is the deep story, and acknowledges that the members shape it as much as the charism shapes us. Do you, associates, have a clear sense of the identity? Or do you grapple with the meaning of the charism, and are you confused by the fact that we grapple with it so? I have my You Are Sent, and let me turn to the prologue. And the description of the charism begins in the prologue on page 17, 18, and 19. 3 pages, not full pages, to describe the charism. Do you have a clear understanding of the charism, or do you grapple with it as we do? How about it? Anybody want to just address that for a minute? Any associate?
What I do, I do through the filter of SSND. I do through thinking about how can I make one in the situations that I'm in, teaching or in other situations. What kind of new opportunities can I find for myself in living that charism?
By our mutual sharing, we are journeying together towards their charism, to being with the poorest of the poor, and to also to be united in prayer. And as for me as a person, it has changed my life.
Education comes in all forms. I know Mother Theresa was concentrating on educating poor young children and young girls, but I've seen grown women that are basically little girls, and I think that we still are doing that, all of us involved with the SSNDs.
I think is very special about the School Sisters of Notre Dame is that they not only look at the horizon, but they look over and above the horizon of the things that they do, more than just education, missionary work, and other things also.
I think I've come to understand that the poor is much more than just people of economic need. The poor comes in many different shapes and forms. And education is much broader than the classroom. And So when you break down those walls, then no longer is it just sisters teaching or people teaching in classrooms, but suddenly it's something that I can take into my workplace, I can take into my parish, I can take to my family, and hopefully change it.
You know, we're in this together as sisters and associates, and that we are, you know, working one hand in hand. As our pin says, we are hand in hand, looking ahead.
My awareness of the nuns that I have encountered and the associates as an outgrowth, but primarily with the sisters, is their devotion to Eucharist. It's my recollection from first grade when I was trained into Eucharist, the love that they have for Eucharist, and that outgrowth, which I won't deny that there were exceptions to this, but the outgrowth from that causes a kindness, an energy for mission, an enthusiasm about life. All of those things to me are from there, and they in turn giving us that love of Eucharist. And to me, it's the basis of the charism. I cannot associate one without the other.
I like the word integrated, and it came to mind, I felt they started getting integrated from 18 years ago, but more so now because I had the experience of Guatemala. Like I could just go downtown and experience the poor, but I found it in Guatemala. And the interesting thing was the education wasn't just book work, but it was teaching the poor how to take care of themselves. And when we got down there to see all these projects that have been done in Guatemala, the water project, how to make the microwave, what we would call a microwave, I was just like, felt I was in the right spot at the right time. The spirituality, it happened during Holy Weeks. It was a different experience of my experience of Holy Week in the United States. So that integration, as you experience it and as you do it, you grow into it. So you have to kind of take the risk, take that risk, and take it with discernment and prayer, and try to follow through.
We are a presence of SSND, and our stories do come together. I look at my story, and I'm not going to go into that, but just being a mother and being able to relate to how to be with children and people who are of different ethnic backgrounds, different physical abilities, mental abilities, whatever it is, to be the outreach there, to have the hands. My symbol of Theresa, when you were talking, was hands. And it was open hands, palms up. And it represented the love and the courage and the strength that Theresa had coming here, starting this new group, leading it to Caroline, and it just kept evolving. And I just believe that's a big piece of what the charism is our hands.
I think it's clear from all that I have said that we're talking, when we say charism, we really have, we've not moved from charism, but we're looking at that deep identity, that deep story that people well-versed in some of this development are telling us about, and that does resonate when we tell the deep stories, even as we grapple with the meaning of charism. But our identity comes from this deep narrative that we recognize ourselves, even in the mystery of it, even when it's not that clear. But I want to pick up a couple of points from Mary Maher's presentation, where having laid this background and this groundwork, she starts to talk about that the deep story is disclosed. Well, Lee talks about it first, and then Mary develops it. That the deep story is disclosed in particular stories that are formed out of it. That's why it's important for all of us to share our stories. And from last night, that you recognized SSND and the stories that were told. That deep stories or narratives lie so deep in our consciousness that they're almost impossible to tell the deep story. but it forms our awareness, our consciousness. It's a style and way of being. It's how we experience things, not just what we experience, to come out of the deep story. One of the examples used that there's a first edition of You Are Sent, and it was distilled from the input from sisters around the congregation that were asked, I think by Mother Georgiana and then by Mary Margaret, what is essential to be in the Constitution? You are sent. The Constitution, we were rewriting the rule. And in the first edition from all over the congregation, that first edition, if you've ever seen it, has 23 paragraphs that really represented the collective thinking of the congregation. Somehow, that's an invitation I want to throw out to you about if you were to describe the Associates and distill from all of that a description of who you are, what would it look like? What would it sound like? I don't mean the guidelines for the Associates. I'm not talking about that. It's kind of a who you are, a deep story. And then in Mary's presentation last year, she reminds us that charism occurs in a history, in a historical event, and that it is reinvented in a new social and historical setting. It's what you said in the title of this, it's Charism Alive. So she raises the question, if charism is reinvented in this time and in this place, what do we need to do to have our founding charism reinvented for the 21st century in Nama? It's a happening of grace born in this historical situation. It's a deeply relational event enlisting the spirit God has given us in our community to answer a crying, desperate need in our particular world situation. And then she used the image of the Tibetan singing bowl with a clangor. You've heard of that. That the singing bowl is the deep story. But a singing bowl is a bowl unless it is struck. And the desperate need is the striking of the charism and its enactment. It's becoming real and live in this time and place. Charism is an event we co-create with God, making ourselves available for this connection between spirit and reality. I know what that looks like as a vowed member. I don't know what that looks like if I were an associate member. Can you tell me? The Tibetan singing bowl is the charism. The clangor is the desperate need. How is that lived out as an associate? When the desperate need of our time comes in contact with the singing bowl. The idea of recreating the charism by bringing our deep story into effective relationship with the needs of the world today can free us from a stifling self-absorption and can put us in touch with the call of God in a vital way for the refoundation of SSND in Nama. We're talking not only reinventing the charism, we're talking about the refoundation of the congregation of which you are a part. This is what Bernard Lee has written. Our deep story is a possession, an inheritance, and is rightly interpreted as God's gift to the church. But whether that story comes alive in any age depends upon whether it can mediate redemption for the cry of the age. The deep story emerges as charism when it is able to rise to the occasion to meet a desperate need of the time. The deep story emerges as charism when it is able to rise to the occasion, and when the occasion, which is the contemporary world in all its concreteness, rises to meet it. When they meet publicly, the world knows it. When the charism meets the need, the world knows it. And he has a beautiful line. At that moment, redemption has a face, and charism is afoot. What must we do? We must be rooted and formed in the deep story, both the Christian story and certainly the story of SSND. We must be deeply inserted into the culture, experiencing its essential passions and marking its hungers in ourselves. And we must sound the gong, the need hitting the charism, and all of that is in us to make them meet in effective ways. And my point is this, from all that I've said about the charism, about the deep story, about the narrative, about our identity coming out of the deep story, the mystery of that, and then this whole thing that to reinvent the charism for its time, which comes out of the deep story, to reinvent the charism, we have to take a long, loving look at our world and bring the two together and say, this is a need. We, SSNDs, members and associates, need to address that need. And I'm saying that if we, the members, the vowed members, have to do that, do you, the associate members, also have to do that? Is that a fair assumption on my part? If it's not, you need to say that, because I'm a learner with you about what it all means. Maybe it's not true. Maybe it is true for some. So to reinvent the charism, this charism alive, we need to look at the world from God's perspective. Really take a long, loving look at our world, at specific real needs in the world situation. And then as persons imbued with the SSND charism, the deep story, the deep identity, together we enter into a communal discernment to determine how we as a unique religious congregation are called to respond to the signs of the times. You need to interpret that as an associate. What I'd like to suggest is that you put down your pens and your papers, and the reflection that you've done we will share about this afternoon, all right? I'd like to think of this as an aperitivo or an appetizer before lunch, what I'm about to do. And it's something that, as I said before, that as a part Baptist, I want to give witness. I want to tell you what has shaped the deep story within me. And that's why I encourage you not to take notes, but to kind of just absorb it. And see what stays with you. If nothing stays with you, or it might raise your own deep story or own experiences that have shaped your heart in SSND. And so I must begin with Mother Theresa. I have spent long years in leadership, and one of the particular graces of my time in leadership has been a call to go to Mother Theresa and to learn who she was as a person because of some of the situations that I dealt with or that were dealt to me. And over the course of the time, especially my 10 years in Rome, I lived with sisters who were literally imbued with the spirit of Theresa. And that came out in the faith sharing that we did, and wonderfully in the gifts that they gave me. Gifts in the sense of some wonderful translations of Mother Theresa and her relationship to Mary. I have all of that from her, extrapolated from her writings. Her relationship to poverty, I have all of that in books that were given me or binders that were given me. And so I want to hold up Mother Theresa, who is dear to all of us. Some people less than others, which always has fascinated with me. Many people are more attracted to Caroline. And she's a wonderful person to be attracted to, but I'm not going to tell her story. I'll let you tell me her stories. But I want to tell you about Theresa. And I consider this an anniversary weekend. Remember, the ship is coming into the New York harbor, and New Yorkers, would it then enter the Hudson to get to the New York harbor? Okay, thank you. Would come to Battery Park, where every year Justine nuns from the Wilton province gathers people to pray on Battery Park in New York. She said people think they're odd when they gather and sing and pray there, but she commemorates it. And I have two of her stories here about that coming into the harbor. So we're looking at Caroline Gerhardinger. We know she was born in Stadamhof, right across the river bridge from Regensburg. We know that as a young person, the school was suppressed in which she was educated. So at 12 or 13, she taught in the Stadamhof school. And Whitman, who was there, begins to form her, sees in her such a graced young girl, young woman. And she was ready to be a religious through the formation of Bishop Whitman. And that's how she lived, really. She began to live a religious life before she even, in a sense, became a religious. It's 1833, and it's time to establish the congregation. Those events don't just kind of spring up. It was an evolution, and there was that sense that it's time. Have you ever experienced that in your life? It's time. Those of you who are married, you might have known, it's time. It's time that we marry. And so that begins, and Whitman, who had been her guide, dies. We all know this story. But I have reflected often on what it means to have the person whose vision it was die just as you begin to move from vision to action. Leaving Whitman's deathbed, Caroline, went to Father Job in Vienna because he said to Theresa, to Caroline, I have shared this with Job and he will guide you. And we know that story. They moved then from Stadamhof, where they were not accepted, to Nuremberg, where they established the convent, the ministry. And within that year, Job dies. So she is, in a sense, utterly alone. The vision then is hers to fulfill. It also strengthens her as a person. All of God's works, you just recited that a few minutes ago, but it's written in her flesh and bones. We also know where are claiming that vision that we need to teach the youth, but especially young girls, to come into their own. Because Mother Teresa herself came into her own. We have a government structure that she struggled for that placed a woman at the head of the congregation, the superior of the congregation, and that the congregation would be marked by a strong central government. That has held, even though there have been times, even in my times, at one of the general chapters, when we thought it was going to break apart. But there's something in the charism. 2 years after these beginnings, Theresa takes her vows and becomes Theresa of Jesus, based on Theresa of Avila. That profound commitment to meditation, that profound commitment and call to contemplation. We know the absolute poverty of that beginning and the rigorous schedule. Remember, we have a foundress who believed in that kind of constant presence within the Blessed Sacrament as much as possible. It was very hard work. And it challenged Theresa's companions, her first companions, and some of her dearest friends. And Anna Holtz could not take it. And Anna Holtz left. Whitman gone, Job gone, and now a good close friend gone. And while these companions left, take a good look around this room. I really mean that. Take a look around the room. Hundreds and thousands of us have come. Sense the presence of thousands of us. And now the number is going to exponentially increase as we include all of our associates. Listen to Maura Eichner say it about this call. So we having little for keeping, moving with clouds and with winds and all that is passing, we rise from the roadways, prairies, islands, from city cement, from little white towns, from thatch-covered huts or pagodas, from sunny adobes and cold wooden shacks. We gather, hearing a pulse beat, an intimate call higher than sound waves, the psalm of her singing, touching her hearts with an instinct for homing. The psalm of her singing touching our hearts with an instinct for homing. We are at home because of her. And we belong to one another in a unique way. Even when we don't know each other, we belong to one another. And together we can do anything. I want to lift a grateful heart on this anniversary of our coming into New York. And I lift not a glass, but a grateful heart to her and her legacy, her sisters, her companions, and to you, the Associates. The legacy I hold up was that she was so in love with God and knew of God's profound love for her. Most of the depictions of Mother Teresa, you would never guess that she literally was filled with love. I mean, some of these pictures are pretty sad and pretty sorry. If you've ever seen a picture or ever been in the presence of Bernini's Theresa of Avila in ecstasy, you have to be ready for that statue. But Bernini carved Theresa of Avila in literally being pulled out of herself and up to God. And that's what the statue looks like. Well, I say that that's Mother Teresa, but it's in her letters. It's in her letters. Her pictures are found in her descriptions. I think it's important to us to claim and name the reality of love in Teresa's life. We need to know what impelled her to get up every day, to be in community, to travel, just to get on that ship Washington, and then to get back on it, or whatever ship she took to go home, and to write more than 5,000 letters, and to serve God with her entire being. We need to know that love and believe that such love is ours as well. And this is the kind of love we need in this our time at the beginning of the 21st century. To love God and then abandon oneself to God, come what may. Love and do what you say. Love and do what you will, says Augustine, one of our forefathers in the faith. And Jesus, don't stop her, he said, for she has loved much. At your table, if you find a short letter from Mother Teresa, could you distribute that to one another? So hopefully you have that, and at some time, really, that's the first letter in the collection of Mother Teresa's letters. She wrote this when she was about 25 years old, but it only deepened within her. Now I am in Jesus. There's some sense of some significant experience with God that she could say, now I am in Jesus. What happened to her that caused her to say, I am in Jesus. I know this to be true. That enabled her to say, may he do what he wants with me. Him I will trust. He will remain in me and I will remain in him, and on him I will build. Certainly we hear the scripture in that. But what happened to her? And then she uses some of these famous lines that we know. Wisdom reckons, love loves. Love gives everything daily, again and again. Yes, certainly love cannot wait. All my life will be lived by God's grace in the service of Christ. What one can imagine, what can do. One of my prayers, besides keeping on, as I told you at the beginning, is to love like this. To love God enough to say, I place my life in your hands. Do with me what you want. Is that not the call of every Christian? And what does that look like? One last poem, really, from Maura Eichner. And this fascinates me, of people reading the life of Theresa. And she writes this about Theresa. Out of my desire, the simple everyday, leaping fires grow. Beloved, you are flame, you are fire, you alone know. If that is not somebody writing, Maura writing about Mother Teresa as a mystic, as somebody so caught up in God, that she speaks of Teresa's desire, and in turn God's desire for Teresa. How many are you familiar with the book You, God? The one thing I want to say about this book, a German Jesuit, read about Mother Teresa and asked permission to do poems, prayer meditations on some of her words. And he uses the familiar, when he wrote it obviously in German, he uses the familiar du. I think in Spanish and other languages is that familiar second person pronoun. And that in the interpretation of our scholars who have looked at this work, that the you, the do, you God, do, God, is dear and darling. And this Jesuit puts on the lips of Mother Teresa her conversation with God as darling. That's what I mean when I say her pictures don't capture that about Mother Teresa. But that trip on the Washington certainly does. What one will do for love. What is it from the Broadway play chorus line? Can't forget, don't regret what I did for love. So that's part of our deep story. Now just two others very quickly, where I feel that the singing bowl, the charism, the deep story of our identity, and the clangor came into contact, and we had the charism afoot, redemption. And that comes from Japan, this story I want to tell you. In the early 70s, the entire congregation, every unit, made a commitment to reach out to some other part of the world in mission and in ministry. And Japan, after extensive discernment, chose to go to Nepal because it was a non-Christian country, some of both the Buddhist and Hindu tradition that they might be familiar with. And in the typical Japanese manner, they did the research, they chose the people, they did all the preparations. And they were going there because of the position of women in that country and the fact that young girls were not educated. And so they sent these missionaries, 3 missionaries. Mary Morley, I'm sure that you may know, right? Maybe you were in Japan at the time. That they went to Nepal and spent at least a year, if not longer, in language study. They tell of the stories of when they were studying, they were living with families, and the sleeping bags that they had, at least one of them, it had bed bugs in it. But in the Japanese manner, you don't complain to your host or hostess. So she endured that while she lived in that family, with that family, as she learned the language. And then there's a story, too, where they had to walk, literally all day long they had to walk to get to Bandipur, where the mission was going to be founded. So much so that their joints became swollen from that journey. But it was to bring the education to young girls that was the need. And their sacrifice, literally, of themselves in all of that, leaving their homeland, their home country, which is part of our deep story, happened with the Japanese in Nepal. They had enough vision to take a risk, to take the journey. We heard that about Mother Teresa. I visited Nepal, so I heard some of that story, and I had some idea of what it meant to get there. And I was driven in a car, and they walked up that mountain. And aside, in the car, I was with Maureen Wana, the sisters met us in Bandipur, and the priest driver, who, without the priest, so he really went wild, this guy, when he was all by himself in this car, drove us up literally the sides of the mountains. Now, we're in the Himalayas, or near the Himalayas. So the Japanese sisters were so excited to see each other that they had this long conversation, obviously in Japanese, and I'm looking around. The guy next to me speaks whatever, Nepalese. So I just kept praying to God as he drove on the edge of the cliff that that if I was going to die, that it'd be quick. We're going up the last mountain, and we come to an abandoned truck between the mountain, the road, the truck, and the cliff. The guy gets out, looks at the mountain, looks at the truck, looks at the cliff, and he decides to go the cliffside. I mean, besides impressing me, obviously, but I had some profound sense of what it meant to risk all of that, and that's part of who we are. So it's a wonderful, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about letting go, really letting go. And again, I think it's the singing bowl, the charism with the need for the education of girls. And you know what happened in their school? They would teach the children, and they would read them books and show them. And the Japanese sisters also taught in English besides learning Nepalese. But the mothers in the village would come to the windows of the school, which was all on the first floor. And you know what they did is their children learned to read. They observed and also were learning to read. And the other thing I saw there was at night, the women built the roads in Bandipur. They carried the slate on their backs and they laid the roadway. But at night, I went with one of the teachers and it's cold at night there, where about a dozen of these women met with this teacher to learn to write their names so that they could at least do that while their children learned to read. There was something so magnificent in that experience. In my last story, this giving witness to where I have seen the charism meet the need, comes from something that every SSND here, I know you know the story better than I probably at this point, and I will tell it quickly. In Romania, our sisters, as scattered and as oppressed and hidden as they were, used to meet in a sacristy in the church. Not every day, but often, to give support to one another. They could not live a religious life for more than 40 years. The revolution happened, and our sisters there found it very hard to believe that Ceausescu had gone. They thought maybe it was another plot, a communist plot, to seduce them into revealing themselves as Catholics and as nuns. We needed somebody to go there to be the provincial of this province that existed, but it was a hidden province. And there was a sister, a first grade teacher in Schwandorf in Bavaria that was suggested. And I went to visit her, to interview her, to ask her if she would consider leaving Schwandorf, leaving her mother who was in a nursing home, leaving the community of which she had been a member for 20 years, and serve in Romania. Within literally a minute of my request to her, she said, certainly, yes. And I told her, no, don't give me an answer. Take time to discern. And she said, I know my answer. And she spoke to me of a dream that she had had a year before of coming into an abandoned, destroyed church that she was in the balcony of this church, and this old woman came in that was injured and very raggedy looking, who collapsed on the floor. And she went down to minister to her. And she said to me, "Today you have interpreted that dream. I can say nothing less than yes." So I had this sense of the hand of God. And it also was that sense of the charism and the need, this willing to go, to risk. And so Margaret Donhauser went to Romania, and she's still there today, 10 years, almost 13 years. And she told me the last time I saw her, which was maybe 4 years ago, she said, "Sister Patricia, I was in the church of my dream." She said, "It actually exists." And in her visiting the Sisters of Romania, she recognized the church. It was only more of a confirmation of her presence there. And it is unclear about this story in this sense that Margaret became the provincial of that province, and we tried to do the ministry. They even have 1 or 2 vocations. But in the end, the province didn't make it as a province. It has become now a mission center of the Bavarian province. But in that story, the hand of God ministering, in this case to our own sisters, was so evident to me. I will never forget her spontaneous yes to what she felt God was asking of her. That lives in us, all of us, that kind of risk-taking. And because she does that, she invites us, Margaret, invites us to not to be afraid, to say yes, to let go and let God. I could give you 100 stories, but I'm not. It is enough. It is sufficient. I thank you for this time, and we're going to now break for lunch.
People ask me, why did I become an associate? Because the sisters have touched my heart. I think most of the people in our associate group are associates because they've been touched by a vowed member in some form. And in the future, there may not be vowed members be touching as many people. But the reality is if the spirit is to continue to grow, then other people will need to be reaching out and sharing the charism of Theresa and Caroline and making a difference. And I think that's the important thing, is to make a difference in the world and to make the world a better place.